Okay, it is 1 o'clock. People are still joining us, which is wonderful, but we are going to get going.
Okay. Liv, I'm handing it off to you now to let people in.
I am going to continue to let in all of our colleagues.
Amazing. And I'm gonna put this in full screen. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the first in our 8-part series on JCC Association's 8 guiding principles on inclusion. This first conversation today will be on B'Tselem Elohim, inherent worth, the first of our 8 principles. If you can, as we're getting started, there is a Google form that I've put in multiple times now in the chat. If you could take a few minutes to fill this out while we are getting started, we'd greatly appreciate that. And if you can't at this moment, we will also send it out in our follow-up email. So thank you again for joining us. My name is Sierra Weiss. I am the Access and Inclusion Specialist for JCC Association. I use she, her pronouns, and I have white skin, curly brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue and white striped button-down shirt today. I'm joining our call from the JCC Association offices in Midtown, New York, which is the traditional land of the Munsee Lenape. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to let my wonderful colleague Liv introduce herself, and then we will get started with today's programming.
Thank you, Sierra. And just as a note, we are visually describing ourselves so that people joining us who have low vision or who are blind can also get situated and get a sense of what we look like and how we're presenting. My name is Liv Mendelson. I'm the Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Consultant for the JCC Association. For many years, I worked at the Miles Nadal JCC as the Director of Accessibility and Inclusion there. I am a short woman with short brown hair, wearing a navy blue sweater and a floral aqua top. And I am coming to you from Toronto to Toronto, the traditional territory of the Credit, Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. And we acknowledge their role as shapers and keepers of culture and as stewards of all of the places that we are hailing from here in North America. And I also use she, her pronouns.
Thank you, Liv. So just to get started, I'll share a brief run through of our agenda for today. We will start with welcomes and introductions as we are doing now, and then we will have the wonderful Sharoni Saboni do a short presentation about the artwork she is creating for our poster series for the inclusion guiding principles. And then we will have a conversation between Emily Laydow and Aaron Kaufman, followed by a Q&A with the audience if you have any questions for our speakers today. And then Liv and I will wrap up and share about the upcoming programs and different things that are to come in the inclusion world.
And just a reminder, we do have captioning on. If you need captioning, you can find it at the bottom of your screen.
Thank you, Liv. So we start today with our inclusion mission statement. Behold how good and pleasant it is when all people live together as one. And guided by the wise words of the psalmist, JCC Association of North America commits to build, nurture, and elevate a culture of belonging in which we welcome, affirm, and celebrate all community members throughout the JCC movement. And it's JCC Association's vision of inclusion and accessibility for all JCCs throughout North America to view themselves as affirming and accepting communities where everyone can contribute.
So this is Sierra, and my slogan for our fellow colleagues all around the continent. It's you, it's us. Inclusion, we know, is not the responsibility of one person. It's our collective responsibility and our collective privilege to create environments that are inclusive of everyone. So we like to orient you and just remind you, whatever your role is while you're tuning in, you are part of this work. Whether you're a camp director trying to create a camp environment where all kids can learn and play together, an HR manager trying to recruit folks and support people and accommodate them in the work environment. Whether you are a COO and you're engaged in choosing what your JCC buys and what services it needs. If you're the aquatics manager, how do you make your pool accessible to all swimmers? If you're on the communications team, is your communication accessible? Are we depicting our whole community? And is everything we do designed from the start to be accessible? And if you're a fitness manager, do we have accessible fitness equipment? So lots of things to think about. We just want to get you starting to think as we hear all the presentations today about what your role is in this work and how this guiding principle of B'Tselem Elohim that we're about to talk about relates to the work that you do every day at your J.
So in building a foundation for our work, since Liv and I started in our roles over the summer, we consulted a variety of professionals throughout the fields, including people with lived experience, JCC Association staff, and external partners in the development of these guiding principles on inclusion. And these 8 principles, together with the complementary series of webinars, starting with this one, will help JCC communities consider ways to enhance their inclusion efforts and incorporate best practices into their communities. So today is the first of our 8-part series, delving deeper into each of the 8 guiding principles.
And the first principle we're going to explore, and really the bedrock principle, is B'Tselem Elohim, inherent worth. We respect the inherent dignity and autonomy of each person. We value people because of who they are, not because of how much they produce or accomplish. Each person has something to learn, something to teach, and something to contribute to community. JCCs strive to create places where each individual is valued.
The slides are moving in slow motion, but there we go. Liv, go ahead.
So as part of our excitement about the 8 principles that we have put together, we are creating a poster series that will illustrate the 8 principles that will be available to you all to display in your JCCs. And we wanted you to have a chance to meet the artist at the outset and to be involved in the shaping of the work. So Sharoni Sivani is an artist, an educator. She is currently the adult education coordinator at Holy Blossom Temple, but for many years worked at the Miles Nadal JCC in Toronto, and has been an artist in residence in many places, and works with the Jewish Studio Project. So welcome, Sharoni. I'm going to turn it over to you to share a little bit about the work you're doing in creating the poster series.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Sharoni Sibany. It's nice to see a couple of familiar faces in the crowd. I am in Toronto, or what you know as Toronto, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am a white woman with dark brown hair and black rimmed glasses. And I am sitting in my living/dining room, my room, all-purpose room now, with a variety of plants and books and mostly window blinds behind me. And so just as I have described myself today, I am also going to be describing the images on each slide as I present them for the folks among us who are blind or have low vision. So let me just set up the screen share, and then you will be able to see what I'm working on. Okay, so I want to start obviously by thanking Sierra and Liv for bringing me into this project. I think it's an amazing project, and I want to applaud and thank the JCC Association for their leadership on accessibility and inclusion. And I think one of the things that really struck me as I read the guiding principles is how celebratory and positive this framing of community really is. So I'm hoping that this raises the bar on workplace and communal openness. And since I did work, as Liv said, in Jewish education in the JCC movement for almost a decade, I'm especially gratified to see how the conversation is evolving from a different perspective. It's kind of cool to be on another side of it. So I think that Liv and Sierra selected me for this project in part because of the series of works on paper that I did last year for JDAME, or JDAM, as we like to say, called My Body's Keeper. And this is a series of works on paper that I did weaving together the visual vocabularies of communal Jewish prayer objects from synagogue life, along with my own objects of pain management for fibromyalgia, which is a condition that I have lived with since my late teens. And the project I was working on was really asking, how can we reconceive of synagogues and JCCs and other communal spaces as places where people really want to turn for comfort and care in illness and disability? How can they be open spaces for this? And so the works on paper were an invitation to consider how we embody our spiritual lives, the relationship between body and soul, how illness affects our relationship to community and belonging. And I'm framing it as illness for this last project because that is my own experience of chronic, episodic, ongoing illness. I can also call it disability, but it's a different category in my mind. And I was also thinking about how our spaces can be more spiritually centering places for recursive healing and support and strength. So the slide that I'm featuring right now features 4 blue Torah cabinets decorated with line drawings, and each one is topped with finials. And the second cabinet from the left is open to reveal a foam roller and medicine bottles inside. And in the background, there's a gold liquid holding together a series of blue and green blobs that represent muscle tissue. And the idea here was that there's this Jewish tradition of beautifying and enhancing the Torah's commandments. This is a practice that we call in Hebrew hidur mitzvah. And that has led Jewish artisans over the centuries to embellish ritual objects with filigree embroidery and other ornamentation. But I want my self-care rituals to be beautiful too. And so I kind of reimagined them through this series. And in this case, the stunning wooden and metal Torah cases of Sephardic and Mizrahi communities inspired this image of Torah medicine cabinets, because these are the potential keepers of all of my physio spiritual needs and supports. I wanted to give you a quick idea of some of the other intersectional possibilities that I had observed last year for JDAME. Here is an image of Dr. Ho's to fill in nerve stimulation, as I called it. This is a brown pen illustration of a Dr. Ho's TENS machine, which is that electrode device for neuropathic pain that used to be advertised on late night television. And it works to an extent. It's great. I love it. And in this case, instead of the wires ending with electrode pads, they end with phylacteries to fill in. And the drawing is sitting against a pink toned watercolor representation of nerve tissue and diagrams of ganglia. And in some Jewish communities, proper use of tefillin is linked to healing, and incorrect use is linked to vulnerability and illness. And I wanted to resist the framework of illness as some kind of divine punishment for moral, ethical, or spiritual missteps. I don't like that. So instead, I find what I wanted to do was to reframe this and take personal comfort from this idea that self-care itself is a holy act. And I wanted to marry these images together because I was living with all of them at the time. Another image in this series was pomegranate pillbox. And so here you see a multi-toned green painting of webbed muscle tissue with clusters of red blood cells. That's taken from medical imaging that I found online. I kind of modified it and adapted it. And the tissue serves as the background for an illustration of an open pillbox in the shape of a pomegranate. And then there are pills spilling out of it. And I hope that it takes a lot of vulnerability to share all of this, but I was hoping that by sharing all of my personal self-care rituals in this way, including the need for medication, that I could help shift the conversation away from stigma to tenderness and understanding. That's my goal. So the pomegranate, which is generally understood to be a symbol of fertility and love and devotion to God in Judaism, I want to reimagine it not only as a symbol of reproduction here, but also simply of restoration. So a daily kind of restoration. All the seeds of possibilities that it could contain for my feeling better. And then here, I'm showing an image called Proverbial Prescription. So this one foregrounds a burnt prescription pad. I had a lot of fun burning paper for this. And it features a brown prescription, if you will, in Hebrew and English, a text from the book of Proverbs. And in this text, it says, "Pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweet to the palate, and a cure for the bones." So in the background, I put this pattern of light brown circles that represents this medical imaging I found of bone tissue, overlaid with honeycomb-shaped drawings of molecular structures of chemicals like serotonin, just the good feeling stuff, right? And what I was aiming for in this one was to think about what are the pleasant words that our community needs today in order to feel supported and sustained? What are the teachings that could help us make peace with our bodies as they are, instead of praying endlessly for the imaginary bodies we wish we had? And if we reframed things like this, what doors would such teachings open up in community? So this was a question that I've put to clergy and other Jewish professionals, and I hope to keep putting to people over the coming years. And it's, sort of an ongoing passion of mine these days to raise this question as a provocation and to incite possibility. And the last image I want to show you from that series was this one I called Tender Pointers. And so in the center of the image, there are two long pointers, and they're shaped like bones, but they each end with a small hand and an outstretched pointing finger. So they're meant to be a yad, right? This idea that it's the Torah pointer that people use to a pointer that they hold to follow the text of the Torah when they're reading from the Torah scroll in synagogues. And so here the pointers are positioned between two stacks of layered papers, and the papers have burnt edges and holes. Again, I really liked burning paper, so I just kept at it. But here I really was thinking a lot about what it's like to live with so many years of chronic pain and to not know what the original source of the pain was, and how much it feels like I'm digging through layers of chronic pain when I go to the massage therapist or the osteopath or the whoever. And it feels like I'm constantly doing some kind of archaeological excavation in my own body, finding relics of all of these old hurts that are still holding me hostage today. So I was imagining the yad as a way of unearthing and releasing the different trigger points in my body. And also just as another way of embodying the connection between body and soul, or between myself and community. So if you're interested in exploring the rest of the images in the series, by the way, I'll put the link in the chat after, but if you don't keep the link or the chat, you can also just Google the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health and Disability, because I published them in the fall 2021 issue of that journal just recently in an article called My Body's Keeper. So just to bring it to the point of what we're doing here today, they wanted a kind of sneak peek. So as you can see from this point, from what I've been working on in the last year or so, I'm really interested in engaging with the material stuff of our bodies. So on this slide, I'm showing you a variety of medical photographs of tissues, body tissues like fascia and nervous tissue and muscle fibers and that osseous bone tissue that inspired the background of the prescription pad. And I've been exploring different types of bodily tissue and anatomical illustration as source material, some of which I expect will make their way into the images for the JCCA guiding principles in different ways. And what I did last year, for me, I think a lot of this is, I should say, why do I care about this kind of imagery? And I think it does two things for me. It shows the interdependence of our built-in systems in our bodies, right? This idea of everything being kind of webbed and interconnected, and there being so many different systems, arterial systems and muscle systems and fascia tissue, connective tissue. But also that when we bring it down, when we're talking about ability and embodiment, when we bring it down to that level of like what's going on inside us behind the skin, there's an opportunity to think about the universal experience of embodied humanness, and then also the multiplicities of ability. So that's part of what's interesting me right now. Last year, I did a different project in which I mapped out random Hebrew letters on a page. So that's the image on the left. I did this with tape. And then I started extending them into a kind of webbed structure, loosely inspired by fascia tissue. And that's the image on the right. It just sort of shows these Hebrew letters becoming other things in a web. And then I painted the whole thing with watercolors and I pulled the tape away. So this produced a final image of an abstracted watercolor painting that became the background of other work. And I think this is really interesting to me when we're talking about the guiding principle of B'Tselem Elohim, inherent worth. And think about this a second, because according to the Jewish creation narrative in Genesis, in the beginning, God spoke the world into being. And so the Hebrew alphabet has this long tradition of being imagined as the building blocks of God's creative process. And when I learned last year, I was learning a little bit with Ariel Evan Mays at Stanford. He told me that there's a tradition in Jewish mysticism that holds that God's presence starts in a pre-verbal inner realm that gradually unfolds and kind of creates the world. So I thought of this, and he said the human being is letters from head to heels. So I could immediately picture the letters formed inside the corners and angles and curves of our tissue inside our systems. And I loved that idea because for me, it says, how do our bodies already contain within them the infinitude of creative possibilities, the allness of ability, all of our potential? And how do we speak the communities that we want into being? How do we listen each other into being? So I'm working on how this could be reimagined for the guiding principles around shlemut, wholeness, and B'Tselem Elohim, inherent worth. And okay. Sorry, yes, just a couple of slides left really quickly, just to give you a sense of where we're going. I also wanted to just share one particular thing, because I don't know how the ideas and images will evolve specifically for this project. I get a little bit of time to collaborate with community, seek input, and work on the images over the next few months, which is amazing. But however they evolve, I want to say one thing that I'm pretty sure I'm going to include in all of them is something that was inspired by this Chinese American painter, Martin Wong, who did a lot of Lower East Side, New York tenement building kinds of images, and who used finger spellings from ASL as a background, kind of architectural skyline, if you will, or maybe constellations, like an astronomical image. So this one is, I'm not doing a good job of the image description here, but in the background of the buildings, you can see a variety of finger spellings. And I will be working with somebody on the ASL piece to see how that works. So just to give you a quick preview of how that starts to evolve, I was thinking of doing finger spellings for each of the values, for each of the guiding principles, as a kind of motif throughout all the images and illustrations, and maybe also using Braille patterns as a kind of constellation somewhere in the imagery. And so on the left, I've put a picture of the Jewish Encyclopedia's reference of yads, the Torah pointers. And on the right, I've put images of finger spellings that I pulled off the internet for a couple of the guiding principles. And in this sense, I'm trying to recenter disabilities as generative sources of creative insight and expression in the world. And the yad is obviously a really powerful image for this as an entry point into connection and into community. So I just want to say thank you, and to say that you will be invited to connect with me if you have any ideas for imagery that speaks to you and your experience and that might inform how I proceed. Thank you so much.
Sharoni, thank you so much. So excited to see your work continue to unfold. It's just so exciting, and you can see now through the chat after you've finished presenting all the different comments people have. Everyone's very excited about your work. So Thank you so much for sharing a bit of your process with us. I am now going to introduce the next part of our conversation. We are so excited to have Emily Ladau and Aaron Kaufman joining us for a conversation. Emily Ladau is a passionate disability rights activist, writer, storyteller, and digital communications consultant whose career began at the age of 10 when she appeared on several episodes of Sesame Street to educate children about her life with a physical disability. Her writing has been published in outlets including the New York Times, Self, Salon, Vice, and HuffPost. And her first book, Demystifying Disability, was published by 10 Speed Press, an imprint of Penguin Random House, in September 2021. And if you have not yet read this book, I highly recommend. It's excellent. Emily has spoken before numerous audiences, from the US Department of Education to the United Nations. Central to all of her work is a focus on and harnessing of the power of storytelling as a tool for people to become engaged in disability and social justice issues. Thank you, Emily, for joining us. And Emily will be in conversation with my good friend, Aaron Kaufman, who I'm so excited to have joining us as well. Aaron joined the Jewish Federations of North America's Washington, D.C. office in January 2016 and is their senior manager of legislative affairs. He focuses on disability and poverty issues. Aaron came from the ARC of Maryland, where he lobbied members of the Maryland General Assembly and the Maryland Congressional Delegation on issues affecting Marylanders with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. Having cerebral palsy, Aaron feels he brings a unique perspective to JFNA's efforts on behalf of people with disabilities. Outside of advocacy, he was the instructor in Project Search Montgomery, a job training program for young adults with significant disabilities. Aaron graduated from the University of Maryland, College Park with a BA in American Studies and with several honors. He is on the executive committee of the Jewish Foundation for Group Homes and is the former vice chair of the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Council. He also served on the board of the National Association of Developmental Disabilities Councils, as well as the board of Disability Rights Maryland. Aaron and Emily, thank you so much for joining us today. Please go ahead and unmute, and I'll let you take it away from here.
Well, thank you to Sierra and to Liv, two people I consider my inclusion sisters, who are just so passionate about inclusion issues and are really good because they get it about when I need to vent about having CP or an interaction. They're just such wonderful friends, and I could not think of two better people, both intellectually and just in terms of decency, for the JCCA to hire. But I must have forgotten their birthday this year or given them a lousy present, because I have the difficult task of interviewing such an accomplished individual in Emily Ladau, an accomplished podcaster and author and speaker and activist. So it really is an honor to be with you today, Emily. And we're going to be going till about 1:52. So let's get started. But it's a joy to be with you.
I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me, everyone.
Emily, I read your book from cover to cover. Everyone here should buy it. Hold on. I'm trying to hold it up and it messed it up. It's a wonderful book. Everyone should buy it. But one thing that you said in the book that I think I agree with, but might be particularly interesting for this crowd, is you said don't shush children when they ask questions about people with disabilities. And I agree with you, because parents always are shushing their children when they want to ask me questions. And I don't think that's helpful, because we are then perceived as foreign, unfamiliar objects, so to speak, to be sort of afraid of. But but in a camp setting or in a preschool, a teacher or a camp counselor can't go out there and say, Johnny has autism and Susie has CP, because of confidentiality reasons. So what is your advice for educating people, for JCC camp counselors or preschool teachers, educating people about their disabled classmates without violating privacy? Because in a way, I think that people, JCCs and other entities inadvertently contribute to that foreignness, because people will ask what's wrong with Jimmy and they can't answer. So
I think it's a great question to start off with. And most importantly, the point of a JCC is community, right? We're fostering a sense of community. And how do we do that? We do that by getting to know the people around us, by celebrating the depth and the breadth of diversity that's represented within our communities. And when you have a group of young children in a school setting, in a camp setting, in any kind of recreational or educational setting, there's bound to be questions about one another, because asking questions is how we learn about the world around us and how we forge connections. And so this is not always the most popular opinion among people with disabilities, but I'm of the belief that it's really okay if children ask questions. Now, there's a couple of caveats here. First of all, I am one person with a disability. I have a physical disability, and you can't see it on the screen, but I'm a wheelchair user. I don't speak for the whole of the disability community. And so this is just my take on this specific question. There's a billion disabled people, more than a billion disabled people in the world. And that means you're going to get 1 billion experiences and opinions on disability. It's natural to be curious when it's something that is part of the world around us. And so while I don't suggest that we turn anyone into a teachable moment, I think it's okay to foster open dialogue and conversation about the noticeable differences between us. Obviously, we don't encourage disrespect. If somebody says, "What's wrong with you?" right? Or "What's wrong with that person?" That's not how we ask those questions. And we take the time to say, hey, it's not that something is wrong with them. It's that they get around the world differently than you do, but they still get around. Or maybe they have a different facial feature than you do, but that's okay, because everybody looks different, right? None of us are exactly the same. And so when we're thinking about how we can really foster that sense of community, the key is to encourage open dialogue and conversation, not to tokenize any one child and to force them to give a response, right? But to say, okay, let's talk about this. Let's engage. Let's understand that diversity is not something that's shameful, something that we should avoid talking about or hide away, but it's actually something that we should celebrate. It's something that makes our community beautiful. So my advice is ultimately, don't shy away from these conversations. Obviously, teach respect, but part of teaching respect is celebrating differences.
I think you're absolutely right. Um, and I think that there are artful ways for people to educate neurotypical individuals, be they camp counselor or preschool students, without violating someone's privacy. You also wrote, and thank you for writing it, because I have a disability and I was like, oh, I've been through that too. But you also write something that I've experienced, that numerous people that you've met with seem obviously nervous around you. And I can say the same thing as a person with cerebral palsy. So what can JCC professionals do to ease people's fears about individuals with disabilities? Because I find I'm always having to put people at ease and make jokes about myself. And it's very emotionally fatiguing, but at the same time, I don't want people to freak out.
I hear you on that. And I think that I have also, as somebody who has an apparent disability, learned to be jokey and self-deprecating and immediately acknowledge the quote unquote elephant in the room, which in my case is my wheelchair, or the tank on my back, as I like to call it. And so we as people with disabilities have learned to put people at ease because we feel that it's our responsibility to dismantle their discomfort. But I've always wanted the script to be flipped and for people to think about the fact that it's also quite uncomfortable to come into a room where you know that people are uncomfortable with you. And when there is this immense stigma towards disability, I don't entirely blame them, right? We've been socialized to think of disability as a negative, as shameful, as something that we fear, that we don't understand, something that we kind of are hush hush about, or something that's just not right. I mean, that's the reality, right? We've been taught that disability is wrong. We've been taught that it is something that is bad and negative. And so right now, what I am trying to do in my work and what so many disability activists are trying to do is just to remove that socialization that we have, that understanding of disability is negative, to shift that mindset to recognize disability as a natural part of the human experience. And in recognizing disability not as a bad thing, but as part of what makes somebody a whole human, we can begin to move away from the idea that we need to be uncomfortable or on edge or walking on eggshells around people with disabilities. And in my book, I have a chapter on disability etiquette, and I talk about ways to interact with disabled people. That being said, one of the key points that I want to make here is you don't need to treat disabled people so differently than you would treat anybody else. How would you interact with a human being? Would you just be natural with any other human being who might not have an apparent disability? If so, just be yourself. That is my best advice. Just be yourself. Just model being yourself. If you don't make it weird, other people aren't going to make it weird. I know that seems a little bit reductive, but honestly, it's true. So the best thing you can do is model how to treat people with disabilities, which is to say, treat them like human beings, treat them like you would anybody else. Kids learn what they live, right? So if they're watching you interact and they say, oh, well, that was just a regular old interaction, they will model that. They will follow that model. That's my best advice.
Thank you, Emily. And what I would say ask next is, I don't know if you notice this in your life, but what I'm experiencing a lot now from where I sit, no pun intended, is what I would call hold your nose inclusion, where people say they want to include, and they know to cover their tushies in 2021, they have to say that. But they're bemoaning all the while the cost, the liability, how having us there detracts from the experience of neurotypical individuals. And so they're really doing it because they feel image-wise and for CYA purposes, they have to do it. So why do you think people should do it, should include not just for image reasons to cover their tush, but because they want to do it?
I think that's a great question. And I think that unfortunately, you're right in that we are still in a period where much of the work that we do around inclusion can be a little bit of a performance. We do it because we have to. We do it because it's the right thing to do. We do it because we're supposed to be living our values. And we forget that living your values actually means internalizing those values and not just including people with disabilities because you're supposed to, but including them because, to go back to the theme of the day, they are human beings who have inherent worth. And so I recognize that it can feel like an added burden, like too much of a challenge to include someone with a disability. And I'm not saying this because I want to go easy on non-disabled people for not being inclusive. I'm saying it because we don't know better. And until we know better, how can we do better? So the first step here is educating ourselves, better understanding disability, the disability experience, recognizing that disability is a history and a culture, an identity and a community. It's not something that makes someone a burden or less than whole. It's something that very much adds to the depth of someone's humanity. And once we shift away from looking at disability as some kind of check mark of diversity, and instead just recognize it as the broader fabric of our communities, of our congregations, of the people in the world around us, then we can begin to shift away from this mindset that accommodating and including people with disabilities is somehow too much of a burden. And there's also this misunderstanding that it requires so much extra effort to be inclusive, when in fact, a truly inclusive environment is one that's better for everybody. There has never been an accessible environment that's not going to work for people. Access does look different for everybody. There are different types of access, but when you implement those different types of access, you're not shutting people out per se. You're welcoming more people in. You're finding ways to make the environment work for everybody. And it's true that sometimes people might have different accessibility needs. Sometimes people might come to you and say, I need this particular accommodation. Can we work on this together? Be open to an iterative process to figure out what it is that's going to make your community more inclusive. And I recognize here we're working with young children, right? So they may not even be aware of how to make things more inclusive for them. So we can take it upon ourselves to educate ourselves, to learn more about the disability experience, to become more attuned to the fact that we can modify and adapt and create inclusive environments that work for everyone, not because it's the right thing to do, but because we're ultimately going to make an environment that's better for everybody.
Well, I think you're right. And I should just say that Emily and I will have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. So please private chat your questions to Sierra, because while we're talking, just sending it in the general chat will be distracting. But I just want to briefly say, in a bit of self-disclosure, that that feeling like you're a burden because of the vibes you get from people, or frankly, outright statements about we can't accommodate, it's too expensive, does a great deal of damage to somebody's mental health. In that, I'll be candid, I've it's taken a lot of therapy to not feel like a burden for me, and I'm still working on it because society has made me feel that way. But and forgive me if this question is too personal, but a lot of JCCs run programs for singles. And have speed dating for Jews and whatever else. And you have said publicly in your podcast that you have a boyfriend, and I'm just really pleased that you said that, because I think too much of society views us as asexual beings who don't desire intimacy and closeness and all that. But what advice would you, when we want it just as much as anybody else, what advice would you give to people who run singles programs and speed dating nights to make sure that daters with disabilities feel welcome and it's not odd, like what's that person with a disability doing here? They're interested in that.
I think there is so much to be said for how we communicate about things like this. How are we promoting it in social media and newsletters? What is the imagery that we're using? What is the language that we're using? Are we noting accessibility? Are we stating up front that accommodations are available? Are we making it very clear that everybody is welcome and everybody belongs at these events? I will be quite honest, I'm an open book when it comes to talking about disability and relationships, precisely because it's still so taboo. And I certainly tried to go the route many years ago of the whole Jewish singles and dating kind of situation. And it's tough because in these communities, we don't necessarily foster a deeper understanding of humanity. And so when, you know, these kids that are in the JCC programs grow up and now they're at the JCC singles events, you know, what have we done to instill in them this understanding that disability is simply a part of humanity? And so it becomes challenging when, again, you're socialized from a young age to misunderstand disability. What you can do is openly communicate about the fact that these events are welcoming, that these events are accessible and inclusive for all. Send the message that there's no dividing line between who belongs and who doesn't belong at these events. Because so often when there have been any events that I've wanted to go to, I've had to make a phone call and I've had to be the one to say, hey, is this accessible? Hey, can I get to this place? Hey, can I do this? Having that communicated to me in the initial messaging makes all the difference and lets me know you are also welcome to be part of this event. And, you know, once you're at the event, someone who works at the JCC is not necessarily responsible for changing the hearts and minds and attitudes of every single person there. The reality is that there are going to be people who have stigma so deeply held within them that it's challenging to navigate beyond that. But what you can do is remember the fact that children grow up and we can foster this recognition of disability as part of humanity early.
Well, I thank you, and I just briefly want to, I'm just going to pose one more question because then we'll take one or two audience questions. But I do want to acknowledge my wonderful cousin, Jeff Elkus, for being here, and my colleague at the Jewish Alliance of Greater Rhode Island, Larry Katz, for being here. My last question is, when my brother is disabled and he needs assistance with all activities of showering, shaving, dressing, eating, etc. And some young women from the University of Maryland, Hillel, were coming to his event. And they were, each of the residents of the home were telling them their chores. I vacuum, I do the dishes. And one person said to me, and Aaron, in a baby voice like that, what is your chore here at the group home? And I said, well, actually, I visit my brother as often as I can, but I am a student at the University of Maryland, so I'm a bit busy with stat and bio. And I know who you are because of the fact that we both have a class at on Mondays in the sociology building at 3:00. I wanted to lash out, but there's a perception that people with disabilities are militant and angry. So anyway, I was just wondering if you wanted to tell the story of the Biden administration official Kings Floyd, who had a similar experience that you recount in your book, or share something that you experienced.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of important things to touch on here. You know, first of all, I want to be very careful not to create any sort of hierarchy of disability, because I think we so often can place value judgments on a person based on what they can and cannot do without recognizing, again, that whether a person may have a disability that's more involved or not doesn't necessarily, you know, put them on some ranking scale, even though that's so often how we tend to think about disability. You know, when I was growing up, there was always this mentality that I was told to think, well, my mind is fine even if my legs don't work. And I've always resented that, because what difference does it make to my humanity whether I have a cognitive or intellectual disability or whether I have a physical disability? You know, we shouldn't hold up these lenses of comparison when we're thinking about disability. That being said, there's also, you know, a problem I've noticed where people are so very quick to judge someone with a disability simply by looking at them and determining what it is that they can and cannot do without actually getting to know the person. And this happened to a good friend of mine who was out to dinner with her sister, and the waiter spoke to her sister instead of to her. what would she like to eat? What would she like to drink? And so it's common assumptions like these, simply by looking at a person, determining what they're capable of, that I really encourage people to shift away from. And I think that comes from, an overall understanding, again, of disability as a negative. And I really, I noticed a comment in the chat that I want to tie this into about disability as a negative label. And, I would actually say quite the opposite. We've been taught to understand disability as a negative, and we've been taught to hold on to these perceptions that we have of disability, when in fact, disability is not a negative, but it's an identifier. And again, very much representative of a history, of a culture. And so the longer that we hold on to this idea that disability is a negative, the more challenging that it becomes for people to embrace it as part of who they are. So, I would very much push back to say that being mindful of how we think about disability as a concept, as an identifier. Certainly not everybody chooses to use it as an identifier. And I, deeply respect personal choice and personal preference. But for me, this idea that we shift away from using the word disability puts that stigma and that shame right back in to the very things that disability advocates are pushing back against and saying, hey, don't make assumptions about us based on disability, but just recognize disability as part of who we are as whole human beings.
Well, amen. I think we're almost out of time, although Sierra does have one audience question. I just want to say one thing that's a pet peeve of mine. I get a lot of calls, frantic calls. Oh my God, Aaron. Oh my God, Aaron. Somebody requested captioning or ASL, and it's hundreds of dollars an hour, and the event's tomorrow, and we just don't have the money in our budget. Can you please help us? And I do what I can, but I always, I have frankly limited sympathy for it, because part of that sense of belonging that Emily was talking about and treating people with dignity and like they're human beings is budgeting ahead of time for those expenses. So and it should not be surprising in 2022 that people are requesting ASL and caption. So the questioner's question was what, Sierra?
So I will ask this question, have you all answer while I pull the PowerPoint back up. But the question is, someone's wondering about the feeling of providing programs specifically to the disabled community. They have programs for adults with disabilities and are restarting children's programming for those with disabilities. And they said, to me, it doesn't feel very inclusive. However, they may feel more comfortable having those programs.
Well, I can just say briefly, and then I want to hear what Emily has to say, that I think sometimes people are too doctrinaire about inclusion, and that maybe seems strange because that's my job. But the most rewarding aspect of my life was going on a birthright trip with just people with physical disabilities, because with all due respect, you don't really get what it's like to be disabled unless you experience it. So I didn't have to make people feel comfortable. So I am an inclusion advocate, but I think sometimes you need those separate spaces. And I just want to also briefly say that I grew up at the Bender JCC of Greater Washington. And so I really value the work of JCCs, and it's been an honor to be your moderator today. Emily?
It's funny, Aaron, I also did the birthright trip for people with disabilities. And I have mixed feelings as a whole about the idea of having programs that are specifically for disabled people and having programs that are inclusive. Every summer I went to sleepaway camp for kids with disabilities, just kids with disabilities. And I was surrounded by them 24/7. And then I came home and I went right back to my mainstream public school, where I was the only kid with an apparent physical disability. And I went right back to Hebrew school, where I was the only kid with an apparent, visible physical disability. And so in a sense, there was a community opportunity there that I didn't really have during my time in my mainstream settings, where I was surrounded by people who did not look like me, who did not make me feel represented. But at the same time, I'm also a big fan, of course, of integrated inclusive settings, not just because I'm a fan of it, but because it's also the law in many cases, right? Especially in educational settings. And so, I think that there's a value in offering a multitude of types of programming. So, for example, if you have a basketball team and a wheelchair basketball team, right? If you have a sports program like a swimming program, and you have people with disabilities and people without disabilities in the swimming program. It's not necessarily that you need to do an either or, it's more of a both and. And I think that both and becomes the solution to ensuring that you're not just creating segregated opportunities, while also still fostering that deeper sense of community for the disability community.
Emily and Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today. It is really such an honor to have you in our first webinar series, and we thank you so much for the insights that you've shared today. We will take a few minutes, Liv and I, to wrap up. I know we're probably going to go a minute or two over, and we apologize as we're getting our grounding in this series. It's bound to happen, but I did put in the chat my email and Liv's email, and I see Aaron put his in as well. We did not have a chance to get to all of the questions that were being posed in the chat, but we are happy to take any follow-up questions or concerns or anything anyone has to ask. You can email Liv and I, and Aaron has put his email in there as well. As we wrap up, something I want to invite anyone who feels comfortable to put in the chat or just to think about as we leave our conversation today. How do you see the principle of B'Tselem Elohim, inherent worth, as part of your work? Feel free to put this in the chat if you feel comfortable, or just think about this as you continue on with your workday today and your week, and the time to come until our next session. So just thinking ahead for this series, it is an 8-part series, and those who participate in the series will gain access to the inclusion posters and booklet to showcase in their spaces with the inclusion guiding principles with the beautiful art that Sharoni is creating and shared a preview of today. And those who attend 7 of the 8 webinars will be eligible to apply for micro grants, which more details will be to come in the coming months about that. And as a reminder, webinars will be on the 2nd Tuesday of each month. This was the first one, and they will run through September. This is the schedule for the webinar series. In our follow-up email, we will be sending a registration link for next month's webinar, as well as the PowerPoint that we used today, a recording of today's conversation, emails, and all the other follow-up details. So if there's anyone who was unable to join today, please feel free to share this with them. We would love as many people participating in this conversation as possible. And Liv, I'll pass it to you.
So many of you have been private chatting us to say they want more. And I always feel that way after I hear Aaron and Emily. More is coming, and we will be sharing the next webinar. We're talking about Shlemut. We're talking about wholeness. You will be getting these, all of this information. If you're not already getting the pros brief, do sign up. And February is JDEM, as we call it in Canada, Jewish Disability Awareness and Inclusion Month. So in a moment, we will share with you, here it is, the beautiful community calendar. There are more than 50 events across JCCs, synagogues, JFNCs throughout the community, and we're the hub for all of those events this year. So check out what's happening. Many of your colleagues in JCCs have put together some very thoughtful programs. We also want to acknowledge Jewish Disability Advocacy Day, and Sierra will be putting that in the link. And so Aaron Kaufman, our speaker for today, runs Jewish Disability Advocacy Day. And Aaron, if you can give us a very quick moment on that. We know we're just about at time, but
yes,
Aaron,
I know, but I just want to let people know that if you were impressed with the incomparable Emily Ladau, she will be honored. And we will also feature Ali Stoker, the first person on Broadway who uses a wheelchair. It's going to be amazing. Please register. Thank you. Hopefully that was fast enough.
That was perfect. And we'll put the link in and we'll send it out after this. And if you are in Canada, there is a separate Jewish Disability Advocacy Day advocating on Parliament Hill virtually, and we'll include that information as well. And I think that just about wraps us up. So there is our email, which we will be sending out. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, and hopefully we've given you a taste and left you wanting more. So we look forward to being with you over the next 8 months of this series, and also lots of opportunities to connect and learn together in between.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.